So today I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of the issues I think remix culture and the idea of the mashup implies in both aesthetics, philosophy, and literature. So much of my work is an investigation and in fact a kind of interrogation of this idea of the archival impulse. And if you look at some of the inspirations of the school like Derrida or Sever or all sorts of people, the archive in the 20th century was kind of a very ambiguous space because on one hand you had print technology, on the other hand you had radio, you had all kinds of other oral cultures popping up, you had jazz, spoken word, the beat poets, all sorts of new ways of telling stories and narratives. But what ends up happening with the 20th century versus the 21st, and this is something I was talking to my class earlier today, is that you have mass production now on the cusp of this kind of complete sense of deterritorialization. So you're looking at mass customization. So the whole idea of the production of subjectivity in the 20th century was really about how people all shared the same text. If you're in a small village in Austria in the 19th century or late 19th, early 20th, more than likely most of the people you knew in that village knew the same songs, they knew the same beer or whatever they were drinking. They were able to kind of relate to one another in a way that had a very significant and narrow bandwidth trajectory. Same thing if you're in a small village in China or Japan or pretty much globally. You could assume that most people in those villages, smaller constellations of urban clusters, had a reference point of a similar culture. Now if we fast forward to New York in the late 20th century, where most of my music and material comes out of, it'd be hard to find even your next door neighbor if you know the same person or the same material. And if you multiply that by one block, you can almost imagine how many different media outlets each person in the industrialized, now post-industrialized world has access to. So that kind of fragmentation, that sense of displacement and also nomadic quality, most Americans move on average every several years. And I live in Tribeca and there's a neighbor below me and a neighbor above me. I barely know them because I'm only in New York about 5 days a month. One is some sort of advertising executive or something. I don't know. But how that relates to the creative process is what I'm going to be looking at tonight. So let me just turn on mirroring. So the whole idea of sampling and kind of looking at hip-hop and how people kind of responded to the late 70s and early 80s in New York is kind of about the way the city itself changed. So if you go back in time and rewind to the late 60s and early 70s, there was an urban planner named Robert Moses. He's a legendary figure in New York. He built what they call the South Bronx Cross Expressway, the Cross Bronx Expressway. So in the process of building this expressway, what they ended up happening to do is basically destroy most of the main neighborhoods of what we now call the home ground of hip-hop. So people had to look at different social spaces, and it was a dramatic kind of reconfiguration of how social space functioned. The highway was in a dead space. The parks where people had gathered before had been paved over. Robert Moses was a notorious, vicious urban planner. So the idea of the city and the urban landscape itself as a kind of compositional palette is something that drives my work. So I'm just going to catch up with this 1 second. While that's loading. The next couple things I want to kind of run past you guys, there we go. That's a really good film called Style Wars. And this is something I like to begin my discussions with. Because essentially, is it possible to turn this bank of lights on? So what you're seeing is some of the best tagged graffiti trains in New York in the late 70s. And what ended up happening is that the kids were using this, there we go, perfect. The kids were using the trains as a network system. They were sending messages. They had encrypted the public spaces of the trains with their own logos and designs. And they, in a certain sense, had appropriated the network. So what you're seeing here is a kind of encrypted social space. If you don't know that language, you're illiterate in it. And for that matter, the idea and the ambiguous tension between public space and private expression is what was driving a lot of the early graffiti movement. So if you don't know what this guy's tag is and you go over it and they find you and your tag, they're coming after you. In fact, there were bitter wars. That's what they're called, style wars. So people would have their logo and their tag and their design on the whole side of a train. Mayor Koch was going crazy. There was a multi-million-dollar campaign to erase public spaces so that they would have this idea of a blank New York. But the kids weren't having it. They kept coming back and tagging the trains over and over and over. So you had this radical tension in public space. And tagging became a kind of new form of message discourse. So what ends up happening is this encrypted sense of public space was for the people who were literate in that code. If you didn't know that code, the kids didn't even care you existed. They were making it strictly for their peers. So what ends up happening at the same time is the public space that was coming out of DJ culture in the South Bronx and so on was also about rhythms, beats. You had Africa Bambaataa, you had Grandmaster Flash, you had all sorts of people reappropriating old records in the same way that these younger kids were reappropriating public space. The records were public memory. So what ends up happening is that if everyone has access to the same rhythms and the same records, how are you going to change that? What makes your style have a better way of communicating with people? So there is a kind of a social Darwinism at work. And what ends up happening is the best mixes and the best tags won. And the funny thing is the advertisers actually took the same strategy. Now whenever you're on a train in Europe or whenever you're on a train in New York, you see advertising just drench the whole train. So they studied the techniques of the kids because the kids had an ability to communicate in soundbite mode. They had a very quick ability to communicate their information and have, in a small amount of space, tell you who they were, what they were into, and what their style was about. That's Style Wars. So in the late 70s, this was a very specific phenomenon to the American urban landscape. It eventually spread to Europe and most of the rest of the world. That's not saying graffiti started in Europe, but, started in New York. But what ended up happening is that that idea of public warfare over these private expressions, the way that the kids would literally go over tags, people had guns. I mean, it was a pretty wild scene. New York was on the brink of kind of urban collapse. Most of the American cities had never recovered from the riots of '68. Detroit was a ghost town, Chicago, urban decay. All these kinds of things were the inspirational landscape for the new composers of this hip-hop movement. So what I want to do is kind of invoke a certain sense of dematerialization, because what's going on here is that the kids are playing with something that they know is transitory and they know it's going to be erased. And the tag is meant to just last a couple days, if not a couple weeks. So the goal was to have your tag go through the network so that so many people saw it that you became what they call all city. And this is a big term in hip hop at the early kind of movement of mid-70s, late 70s. The idea was to bomb the system, and they called tagging bombing. So bombing the system meant that your tag would go all city, and you would strategically choose the best train lines so that your tag would move through the system, so that enough people would see it that everyone, that's how you got fame. So with blogging and with this idea of the personal networks that we now have in the 21st century, you can see a similar parallel kind of development going on, where you have a personal sense of media in a public space. So one street now migrates to the new street, the internet. So what I'm doing is drawing a parallel between the urban landscape and the networks that move through it and the global networks of the internet and its relationship to how people produce culture. So hip-hop has obviously transformed the world as we know it in the last 30 years. So has techno, so has drum and bass. All these styles are a kind of relentless minimalism. They're about the prolonged present. When you hear this kind of tempo patterns and the 4/4 structures, it's very rare to hear another rhythm in 6/8, 3/4. It's always in 4/4. I mean, it's like relentless, relentless minimalism. So if you go back to the late 70s, you can look at Kraftwerk's idea of the Bahnhof, the kind of Trans-Europe Express is a very classic track. Africa Bambaataa did a cover of that called Planet Rock. So the pun here is that you not only have exchange and appropriation at a very early stage where kids in Berlin are downloading and checking out, but not downloading, they're actually hearing cassettes back then, of mixes coming out of New York, but kids in New York were hearing what was going on in Germany. For some reason or another, the industrial cultures of those two styles meshed, and that is the beginning of what we like to call electro. So Detroit, on one hand, in the late 70s was a bombed out scene. House music, techno, those were considered very radically underground. And they're usually kind of a furtive gay scene, weird, kind of bombed out warehouses where people would cluster, and drag queens, all sorts of crazy stuff. So that was Detroit. In New York, you had a club scene that was going on with downtown Manhattan kind of stuff. You also had the outer boroughs. Many of the styles that were bubbling up and going on were essentially local, and you had to have a word-of-mouth network or a social peer group that would exchange information, much in the same way you now have a Facebook peer group. You say, hey, this party's going on, or so on and so on. So the networks were always local. They were always about maintaining and updating your information, and also making sure that you had your tags in the system and that people knew what was going on with that specific encrypted space. So the reason I'm looking at the trains as a network and I'm using as a metaphor for the internet